Well, thanks for joining me in this video that reveals the solution to the ZebraZapps challenge number 7. Just as a quick review, here's the working copy that we were trying to recreate. It has a timeline and a slider, and as I move that slider, it shows the different postage rates for that time. And it goes from 1900 to 2000. So there's that first part is just dragging the slider around, and then the other part is I can type in a different year, so I'll put in 1964. The slider moves there and it shows that stamp. So you can type whatever, number 2012. There we go. So that's our goal. Now in the rebuild, I'm not doing the background stuff. You can add that on your own later. I wanted to just focus on the parts that contribute to the interactivity. So the first step is you want to import all the graphics and then create your timeline by putting all the pieces together, lining them up edge to edge in the order that they're labeled. So we have 1900, then there's a 1917, 1919, and so forth. When you add all those together, it's going to give you a piece that corresponds to the years 1900 to 2000. Then also you'll want to have your slider. And the next step is to draw a path that's going to position that slider along the timeline. So we're going to take the path tool and click to start it. And then move your cursor out all the way to the far end and click to create your other end. And then hit return to stop your timeline, and then if you did it right, they should be lined up quite well. You can adjust them if you need to. I think those look pretty good, so I'm going to close that. I'll call this timeline. Now, if we look at the properties, what we want to do is now attach this slider to be positioned along that timeline. And so we look at the properties of our slider, and under actions there's a ribbon for the path name, and this is what path you're going to attach this to. So you click right in that square, click on the path, you'll see that it gets filled in, and then we want to snap it to path. We'll leave that as true, and we want to put in the values. Now by default the start value is 0 and the end value is 100. That works pretty well if you're doing a percentage or if you don't have any particular external constraint. But here we want to make values that are going to correspond to these years. So the start value is actually 1900, and the end value is 2014 because it takes us all the way to the end of the current year. So those are our values for the path. So there we have our slider. We have a slider arranged on that timeline. And now we've got to link where you have the slider on this timeline as to which stamp will show up. So now we're going to add the functionality where when the slider is moved, we show a different stamp corresponding to that year. So we begin by taking a stamp, just grab the first one, 1901, position it up here. We also have to make sure that this slider is movable. So go under the actions property and pick movable is true. And now we're going to use the collision trigger, which allows you to say when one object has collided or overlaps with another. So whenever, and this is the benefit of having broken the timeline up into separate objects, so I can tell specifically which one the slider is overlapping or colliding with at any given time. So if we go to collision, we want to collide with, you have to pick the object you're colliding with, and we'll just go to the first one, which is 1917. We click there. You see that it gets filled in, so it's telling us that's the action we're looking for. And when that happens, I want to trigger a switching of this image. So I go over to the 1901 ping, go to the properties, appearance, fill graphic, and that creates a new custom property. Now this is collapse. You'll want to always expand that area and see, so there's several different properties or parameters for that setting, and we want to switch now which fill graphic is being used. So come back over to your asset library and pick the 1917 stamp, bring it over, hover, release, replace that object only. And now if we play this, when I move the slider over 1917, it switches. Now when I go back, it should switch to 1901, so we need to add more functionality, but the core part of our lesson is working. So in order to do that additional switch, we need to go back and add another collided with, this time when it collides with 1900. And so we'll do the same thing. We're going to come over here and add a new fill graphic ribbon, and this time it takes the current value, so that's fine. So we just keep doing this. We're going to add another one, which will be the 1919, and on that one we'll create a new graphic, and this time we'll add that up here. Now the wires go sort of in reverse order as you're setting this up. I got to expand this. Remember, you need to expand it all the time. You can get tricked into just wanting to copy it right away. And we'll do one more, which is 1930, I believe. Yeah. And so that will be one more new property. Expand it. Take our 1932 stamp. Replace. Let's give this a shot. Our first 4 sections ought to be working. So the collisions will trigger the swapping of each of the graphics. So anyway, you know how then you would replace all the rest of those. It's very straightforward. It just takes a little time and being careful, but it's easy enough, and it just works all the way out to swap any of those pictures. Okay, well, if you have gone ahead and worked out all those pieces, you should have something that looks sort of like this. A lot of spaghetti, but it's all very clear. Each one of the collisions links to swapping a specific related image out. And that should be working great as you slide that slider all along the timeline. Now our last piece of interactivity is to let the user type in a date and have the slider go there directly. So I put in a text object here just to give the instruction. Now the critical piece is we're going to use a text input object. So go to your toolbox, and it's the input text object. It's a little T in a box with an arrow beside it. So I'm going to select that, and then over here toward the side of my instructions, I'm going to create this text box. Now just like other text, you can change the font, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than it was, and make it up to 18, make it bold, and I'll actually make that text red so it stands out a bit. So that's going to be a place where the user can type in a number, and we want that number to drive where the slider is. And so it's really very straightforward. The text input field, which is what the user types in, we're going to link that over to our slider, and we want that to be in the properties the path value. That is where on the path you want it to go. And you can see already that it's at 1900, and that's because that's the beginning point. One other thing we might want to do is if we go to our text properties and say values, we want to say only allow numbers. Now you could be a lot fancier too and try to figure out what numbers are not in the right range. We're going to leave that for an advanced exercise sometime. But this should be enough to have done everything we need to do. We'll run it. And if I type in 1962, there it goes. So this drove the position of the slider, and then the collision is still happening, and so that changes the stamp number. Notice that it's a two-way connection, so when I drag this down, that goes, the number changes as well. Now there's one last little thing that's not as good as it should be. Is notice as I drag the slider, I get these funny decimals, and that's because you can't control precisely that you'd land on an integer, and because these are linked, they're bound together, the slider position and the text value. It's a two-way connection. Now there are a couple ways you can do to fix this. I'm not going to do it in this video because we've covered enough. The quickest way to fix this, actually, it's just a very superficial fix though, is to just make this text box a little narrower. And that way it won't show the decimals. I know that's a cheap way to do it, but at least it fixes it without having to go to rounding or figuring out how you can update. And it's certainly possible. I think we've covered enough topics for this challenge though today. So you might want to put in your backgrounds and finish this up, but hopefully that gave you insight into sliders, into overlapping, into linking text objects. So good luck. Hope that made some sense, and we'll see you at the next challenge.